1819. The young United States stood in a fragile balance, evenly split between 11 free states and 11 slave states. On the surface, it looked like stability, equal representation, equal power, a nation carefully holding itself together. But beneath that appearance, balance was never the real priority. Expansion was. Even before the phrase existed, Americans were driven by the belief that their nation was destined to stretch westward across the continent, an idea that would later be called manifest destiny. By 1819, the country included states like Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama, but pressure for growth was already building. In 1818, the Missouri Territory applied for statehood, and almost simultaneously, Maine sought to separate from Massachusetts and enter the Union as well. Missouri was expected to become a slave state, which would tip the balance in favor of the South. Northerners opposed this fiercely, arguing it would expand slavery, while Southerners insisted new states had the right to decide for themselves. The debate consumed Congress until Speaker Henry Clay proposed a compromise. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and slavery would be banned in future territories north of latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. This agreement, known as the Missouri Compromise, temporarily preserved peace, but only delayed the deeper conflict. As the nation continued expanding, the pattern repeated. Arkansas entered as a slave state in 1836, Michigan as a free state in 1837, Florida as a slave state in 1845. Each admission tried to maintain numerical balance. Then came Texas. Formerly part of Mexico, Texas had won independence and sought annexation by the United States. Washington hesitated, fearing war with Mexico and the addition of another slave state, but expansionist pressure and foreign interest in Texas shifted opinion. On December 29, 1845, Texas joined the Union as a slave state, immediately creating tension. Texas also claimed vast disputed lands still contested by Mexico, and now those disputes belonged to the United States. President James K. Polk, a committed expansionist, was determined to acquire even more territory. He first attempted diplomacy, offering Mexico $30 million for California, New Mexico, and borderlands, but Mexico refused. Polk then sent U.S. troops into disputed territory, provoking confrontation. In 1846, Mexican forces fired on American troops, giving Polk justification to declare war. The Mexican-American War saw U.S. forces push deep into Mexico, with future Civil War generals like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee gaining early experience. By 1847, American troops captured Mexico City, and the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Mexico ceded an enormous region, including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The United States had achieved continental expansion, but every acre of new land reignited the same question: would it permit slavery or not? The Compromise of 1850 attempted another balancing act. California entered as a free state, other territories would decide slavery through popular sovereignty, and the Fugitive Slave Act required escaped slaves to be returned even from free states. That last measure outraged Northerners and energized abolitionists. Senator Stephen Douglas pushed popular sovereignty further with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, repealing the Missouri Compromise line and allowing settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to vote on slavery. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded the region, turning Kansas into a battleground. Violence erupted, homes were burned, militias formed, and guerrilla warfare spread in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Dozens died as the nation watched frontier bloodshed foreshadow a larger war. Meanwhile, North and South were growing further apart culturally and economically. The North industrialized rapidly, relying on wage labor and attracting immigrants who often opposed slavery. The South remained dependent on plantation agriculture and enslaved labor, especially after the cotton gin made cotton production more profitable.
To Southerners, ending slavery threatened economic collapse. To Northerners, expanding it threatened moral disaster. Political flashpoints deepened the divide. The Fugitive Slave Act forced citizens to assist in capturing escaped slaves, enraging the North. The Republican Party emerged largely to oppose slavery's expansion, and one of its rising figures was Abraham Lincoln. His debates with Stephen Douglas made him famous in the North and feared in the South. Violence even reached Congress when Senator Charles Sumner delivered a blistering anti-slavery speech and was beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor by Congressman Preston Brooks. Then came the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Scott, an enslaved man who had lived in free territories, sued for freedom. The Supreme Court ruled against him, declaring African Americans were not citizens and that Congress had no authority to restrict slavery in the territories. The ruling outraged abolitionists and energized further. 2 years later, radical abolitionist John Brown attempted to spark a slave rebellion by raiding the federal armory at Harpers Ferry. He seized weapons and hostages, but was captured by U.S. Marines led by Robert E. Lee and later executed. To the South, he was a terrorist. To many in the North, a martyr. Tensions reached a breaking point in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected president on an anti-slavery expansion platform. Though he promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, the South saw his victory as proof they had lost national power. South Carolina voted to secede, soon followed by 10 other Southern states, forming the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. Lincoln refused to recognize their independence, determined to preserve the Union. The imbalance between the two sides was stark. The Union had roughly 22 million people, vast industry, and extensive railroads, while the Confederacy had about 9 million people, far less manufacturing and weaker infrastructure, though it possessed strong military leadership. By early 1861, federal authority in the South had nearly disappeared, except for isolated holdouts like Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Surrounded and undersupplied, Union troops there refused Confederate demands to surrender. On April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire. After 34 hours, the fort fell. The Civil War had begun, the result of decades of expansion, political compromise, economic divergence, legal battles, violent clashes, and above all, the irreconcilable conflict over slavery that the young nation had never truly resolved.